Serious. Nurses and doctors of Reddit, what's your weirdest, scariest paranormal stories that took place during work? First story. Did a rotation in a burn unit. There are tons of stories that go around, but I'll share my favorite. A pimp lit one of his prostitutes on fire, and she immediately bear hugged him, causing them to both suffer pretty severe injuries. Unfortunately, hers included an inhalation burn. They both were being treated in the same intensive care unit, but on opposite ends. Weeks later, she ends up coding and passes away, and after about 30 minutes, as things start to quiet down, the guy starts screaming from his room. Get her out. Get the goddamn bitch out of my room. Second story. My aunt is a nurse and told me some stories, but this one stuck with me. There was an old lady who insisted on being strapped down at night in her bed. She told my aunt that there was a dark figure that was trying to grab her and take her out of the room, where she would die. My aunt and other nurses oblige, and for the next few nights she would check on her, and it would look as though someone was trying to pull her from the bed randomly while she slept. My aunt is then off, and whoever is this lady's nurse does not strap her down at night. Nurses found the old lady dead, laying on the floor by the door, her hand stretched out past the door and into the hallway. Third story. I've worked in a small family-run nursing home for 6 years as a nurse aide. It was an orphanage before it became a nursing home, and unfortunately, before being shut down, the orphanage had a history of severe abuse and neglect. Unfortunately, it's not gossip, the owner herself has told us. When residents get close to death, they always see a little girl. One of my patients, a very alert gentleman, he knew all our names and was very alert and oriented. I was passing dinner trays and saw that he had his back turned and was talking and laughing in the corner. I knocked and asked him who he was talking to. He chuckled and said, "This little girl came into my room. She was scared." He died 3 days later. About 6 months later, had another patient screaming about a little girl grabbing his feet, and she needed to leave him alone. He died that night. She's come up over the years. It's always the same thing. They see her, and then they die. Other co-workers have had the same experience. It's very unsettling. Fourth story. I'm a psychiatric nurse. Early in my career, I worked at a residential mental health facility. There was a resident I'll call Marion Duchesne. He was an elective mute, which simply means that he couldn't talk, but there were no pathological findings as to why. He had spoken earlier in his life, and in fact seemed quite normal back then, with the notable exception of being close to 7 feet tall. He'd been raised in the Deep South and joined the military when he was 19. After boot camp, he was stationed somewhere in the South. One night he just vanished. It was declared in a way without official leave for years, and finally he was declared missing and dead. 10 years later, a 7-foot-tall man walked into a Veterans Health Information Systems and Technology Architecture hospital emergency room in my part of the Midwest and said to the receptionist, "My name is Marion Duchesne and I've been dead for 10 years. Those were the last words he ever spoke. He was covered with dust and he was wearing the same clothes he'd been reported to be wearing the night he vanished. His social security number had not been used and he had no identification on his person. However, they were able to identify him, I guess, via fingerprints. He was well fed and in good health, except for his refusal to speak. The family was notified, but they said they had already grieved their lost man, and that whomever was claiming to be him simply could not be. They said he was a haint and a stand-in for their dead relative and demanded not to be contacted again. Marion paced all day every day. Not in a frantic way, but just lumbering up and down the halls and outside. He smiled all the time and would be moving his mouth in a way that indicated talking or muttering, but he was dead silent. He had an unnerving habit of throwing his head back with his mouth wide open, as if he were laughing heartily, but not even a breath could be heard. If told to go to the dining room for a meal, he'd go and eat, but if nobody told him, he just kept pacing, never indicating hunger. If offered a cigarette, he'd smoke it in an oddly formal way, almost delicately, if that makes sense. But he never seemed to crave smoking. The man wanted nothing. If I talked to him, he appeared to listen, periodically throwing his head back in that laughter-mimicking way of his. There was nothing to do for this man. Various medications were tried, but they did not affect him either positively or negatively. Occupational therapy did nothing because Marion would just grin, and unless told to stay put, he'd get up and start pacing again. On my last day at that job, on my way to something better, the last thing I saw was Marion, pacing in the parking lot, throwing his head back to laugh. Later I wondered if all along I'd been dealing with a ghost. All these years later, I still don't know. Fifth story. I was working at night, and one of the patients died while I was in the room. We tried everything to revive this person, but it didn't work, so after doing the papers and everything I went to another place in the hospital, and I swear to God that this patient who I saw dead touched my right hand. I think that I have never cried that much in my life. Sixth story. Oh, I have so many I don't know where to start. I worked in geriatrics nursing homes for years, so most of our patients died within a few years of being with us. Anyways, I had a new patient move into one of the rooms on my hall that my previous patient had just passed in. My new patient kept calling at night, saying that there was this woman who kept coming into her room and trying to talk to her. At first I just passed it off on her being in her 90s and struggling with dementia, so I assured her that I would lock her door at night to make sure no one could come in. After about a week of this continuing to happen, I hooked down with her and was asking what this woman looked like, thinking she may just be hallucinating her daughter or sister or something, and she proceeded to tell me that this woman had a pink robe on with blue fuzzy slippers and her hair up in curlers. And the woman would come and sit at the foot of her bed, pat the new patient's feet, and try to talk to her, but she couldn't understand what she was saying. I almost pissed myself. The patient that I had had in that room prior to my new one went to bed every night in her pink house robe, blue slippers, and her hair in curlers. It stopped after about 2 weeks. Seventh story. When I worked at the funeral home, I was told a story about an elderly lady that had died. The husband said he wanted her to be buried with her ring as she never took it off. My coworker was in the morgue and was washing the body. She removed the ring to mark it down on the paperwork. As soon as she did, a styrofoam head they used for wigs went flying across the room. She just said out loud, all right, I'll put your ring back on, no more disturbances." Eighth story. A ward I worked on once had a patient who was a psychic medium as a patient. We had a bit of a laugh with her as she was on the ward for a while. She'd had a stroke which affected her mobility, and she would do readings for the staff, etc. from time to time. I took it all as just a bit of fun until one evening when she pressed her nurse call buzzer and told us to go check on a patient in a side room as he was dead. We went to check and sure enough found that the gentleman had died. Later on we asked our psychic patient how she had known, and she told us she had seen him coming out of his room obviously distressed. She realized he had died and had to explain to him what had happened and help him to pass over, go to the light. Now I am not a believer, but that gave me the creeps. Ninth story. Student nurse here. I once had a patient say, "Do you ever feel the chill whenever you're on the computer?" Don't worry, it's just a nurse who worked here a long time ago. She doesn't understand your technology, so she's trying to learn. I always feel someone is looking over my shoulder when I'm on the computer, so this freaked me out. 10th story. I am a psychiatrist, and during my training years I worked for 6 months at a ward treating patients with depressive and anxiety disorders. It was an old building who had been housing psychiatric patients since the mid-1920s. On our floor we had 13 beds and a nursing station, a living room, and a few conference rooms. One day a few weeks in, I am interviewing a patient who, when asked about sleeping patterns, tells me she have heard a baby crying at night waking her up. There are no babies in that hospital as the place is situated far away from housing areas and there were restricted visiting hours. Afterwards the nurse pulls me aside and tells me that the baby crying thing is not a psychotic symptom. She is very serious about this, but won't elaborate. I kind of shrug it off, as either way it does not change the diagnostic or treatment, and forgets about the experience. Around 3 months in my stay, I sit in the nurses' station and 3 nurses behind me are talking. One of them says she is very active today, and the other says, "Really?" "Oh, hadn't noticed." I turn around and ask them who they are talking about. They look at each other, and then one of them hesitantly says, "Well, there is a baby here. She cries sometimes." I of course says no, but they just kind of shrug and smiles. Not 30 seconds later I hear it. It sounded far away, but not too far. A cry, clearly a baby's cry, sounding like it is separated from us by maybe 2 or 3 walls. I am perplexed and look at the nurses. They look at me like, "Told you so." I of course ask about this, but they can't say anything else but this faint baby cry is there and have been there always. Since then I heard it maybe 2 to 3 times a week. I told a new doctor about it who laughed. However, a few weeks in her stay, she came to me, white as a sheet, and told me she heard it in their coffee break. All the nurses just kind of knew about it, and being in psychiatry, hearing that kind of stuff is not really something you brag about. I was transferred and haven't heard it since. I think about it sometimes, but I don't really know what to make of it. 11th story. This story is more about my mom. She's a nurse. She was walking through her nursing home and acting like it was a normal day. But it wasn't. People were looking at her really weirdly. After a couple hours, someone asked her what happened to her child. She asked what they were talking about. They said that everyone has been seeing a bloody boy walking beside her all day. Then she looked behind her and no one was there. Then all day after that, people kept asking what happened to her child. When she got home, she looked up every incident at her nursing home. She found something about a murder, but I don't remember the whole story. 12th story. There is probably some medical explanation for this, but still the weirdest thing I've seen as a nurse so far. We had a very robust, confused old lady on our floor. Her room was in front of the nurse's station, so we could keep an eye on her, and had one of our nurse's aides as a sitter too. She was always fighting, kicking, trying to get out of bed. Very restless and agitated, as some patients I've had before can get before death. One day we were called into the room as her heart rate was going down and she lay still with her eyes open. It was 30-20, then flat-lined. We checked for a pulse and did not find any. She was a do not resuscitate, so we did not attempt resuscitation. We close her eyes, prepare to get the body bag and call the family. The sitter remains in there to start getting the body ready. Less than 10 minutes later, she calls us back in. The old lady is at it again, hitting, kicking, trying to get out of the bed. She came back to life. Honestly, we found the situation hilarious, and I still have never seen any patient come back like that on their own. I think she made it out of the hospital too. 13th story. I am a nurse in a hospital, and my patient was a well-known card reader in town, not too unheard of in Louisiana. I had actually gone to her about 10 years prior, and she was eerily accurate. While caring for her for a few days, I walk into her room and she is unresponsive. She had been very lethargic all day, but now she was out. Her daughter is at the bedside and is trying to wake her up. I sternal rub her and inflict pain with no response and a very thready pulse. I call a rapid response. This woman then wakes up randomly and was full of energy within a 30-second span. She told me she was dead and watching me in the room the whole time. Knew exactly what happened. She said God told her it wasn't her time and sent her back. She went home a couple days later, and she is still doing card readings. 14th story. I worked in a pediatric hospital and had always heard that the 4th floor right outside our oncology unit was haunted. I worked 3/12s normally, but would pick up overtime and picked up a night shift. I was working in the neonatal intensive care unit, which happened to also be on the 4th floor, but on the opposite side. The oncology unit had a staircase that was a shortcut down to the cafeteria, which was on the 2nd floor. At about 3 o'clock in the night, I was ready to take a short break and wanted a cup of coffee from the cafeteria, so I decided to take that staircase. I walked through the automatic double doors and saw a kid skipping down the hall. I called out to him as I was afraid a little kid had snuck out of a patient room. As soon as I called out to him, he turned and in the blink of an eye totally vanished. A lot of other nurses and doctors had seen the same little kid skipping in that same hallway. Of course, I chalked it up to just exhaustion and didn't really think about it much after that. But you are damn sure I didn't use that hallway at night ever again. 15th story. I used to work in a nursing home as both a certified nursing assistant and a licensed practical nurse, and while nothing too crazy happened, there were definitely things that happened out of the ordinary. I remember one time after someone had died, I was cleaning up her body, and the door to the room swung wide open. Even though it had been firmly latched, nobody was there. It gave me the creeps. There were instances of furniture being moved, lights turning on and off by themselves, and toilets randomly flushing by themselves as well. I also remember I had one resident one night who asked me to make sure I closed the door to the closet that was at the end of her bed, and she told me that when it was open, that woman kept going in and out of it all night, and it kept her awake. 16th story. I'm a nurse. I've witnessed quite a lot with Alzheimer people. They often develop their own scenarios in their own head, often accompanied by vivid hallucinations. Once during night shift, I heard a woman scream in fear. Checking on her, she managed to climb into her wheelchair in pure panic, wanting to flee her bedroom. Asking what was wrong, she thought the building was on fire. Now, what's important to mention here is people often make claims that people are just crazy or dreaming badly or something. But this is not the case. People with hallucinations have been found to actually see, hear, smell, etc. something when their hallucinations occur, as the same locations in the brain are stimulated as if they would get real impulses. That woman actually saw fire. She actually smelled fire. She didn't just make that up to be crazy. It's what her brain told her was happening. And she was in real panic for her life. And the same applies to when those people see someone else in their room. When they want me to guide someone out of the bedroom who isn't actually there, seemingly standing right behind me. And it makes no sense to discuss with them that no one's there. Do them, someone there. And you better do your best effort of improvising to guide that someone, even if it's no one, outside. Play along, and they'll be fine. This, to me, is the scariest thing at work. They see something you don't. 17th story. My mom used to work as a night nurse in the burn unit at a hospital in Dallas, state of Texas. She told me that people would always talk about how the burn unit was apparently haunted. She wasn't really sure whether or not to believe this until a little girl came into the unit with horrific burns. The little girl did not always have parents stay the night with her, so my mom would try to check up on her pretty often when she worked. One night, my mom asked the girl if she ever got scared at night. The little girl responded, "No, I don't get scared because an old woman comes to read to me every single night and sits beside my bed while I fall asleep." This shocked my mom because there were no older women working in the burn unit night, and she would usually be the only person on duty during those times. It isn't that scary, but she always recalls it being one of the craziest things that has ever happened as a healthcare worker. 18th story. My aunt used to work as a labor and delivery nurse, and I remember her telling this story to my mom once. She was working a shift where the woman she was assisting in childbirth had lost her grandmother. They were not close and had never met not long before her labor. In the middle of the frantic moaning and crying during delivery, the woman suddenly looked to a corner of the room, heaving and sweating. The only thing there was an empty chair. Nobody was there. She started talking to the corner, seeming to respond to questions and generally just having a full-blown conversation with what seemed like herself. My aunt and the other nurses thought she was just delirious and tried to just soothe her through and ignore her. The woman's husband and her mother would try and calm her down and say there's no one there, but she would continue talking to the corner. When she was out of labor and they gave her the baby to hold, her mother and boyfriend were there, and she turned to her mom and smiled and asked, "Did you hear her earlier? Is your new life everything you imagined it would be? An adventure?" The mother was shocked. Apparently, the mother was an immigrant from China and left her parents behind for a life in the United States. The last words the grandmother had spoken to the mother directly was, "I hope your new life is everything you imagine it will be." An adventure. The grandmother died soon after. She had never met her granddaughter, and there's no way the woman would have known the words she said. 19th story. My mom works in a hospital. During Hurricane Maria, the building suffered a lot of damage, and administration chose to close a whole floor instead of fixing it. It used to be the pediatrics floor. When people go up there, they can clearly hear babies crying, even though the floor is completely abandoned, and the floor below is for adult patients only. It has been caught on video. 20th story. Oh shit, I got one. In medical school, we had an anatomy exam on like November 1st or 2nd. So on Halloween night, me and my roommate decided that since everyone else was off partying, this would be a good time to get some uninterrupted studying going. Well, it was already creepy as hell being in the basement of the medical school surrounded by cadavers. Well, an hour or so in, we're going through anatomy, and all of a sudden on the other side of the laboratory a faucet suddenly turns on. These faucets are the ones that have motion sensors on, and were all the way on the other side of the laboratory. We were a bit creeped out, but dismissed it. We get back to work and then it happens again, but on a different side of the room, again far from where we are. This happens maybe 2 more times over the course of an hour or so. Finally, we had enough and we decide to leave. As we're gathering our stuff and heading out, we remark to each other about a side room where the instructors will prepare their lectures and for exams, etc. We decide to head in to see what was in there, and we stop dead in our tracks. Like I said, we were the only ones in the laboratory, and we had heard no one else come in. In the side room there is some person that we don't really recognize bent over, working on a cadaver. Their back is to the door, and me and my friend were being plenty loud, but yet they remain hunched over working on the dead body. We have no idea who this strange person is, and we had it now. We slowly back out and get the fuck out of there. 21st story. In the emergency department, we had a patient brought in for a psychotic episode. Mental health issues or drugs or both. Not unusual, too unusual for our location. His sister came with him in the ambulance, and when explaining to our nurses why he was being like this, she was in tears because she has no idea. A normal student, a non-smoker, and just a casual drinker. Room 19 is kinda joke that's where people go to die. I guess that's not funny, but you need some humor in the emergency assistance, and people do tend to die there anyway. After a full laboratory panel and computed tomography, nothing appeared wrong with this guy at all. We ended up calling in one of the hospital's chaplains from their request. He's there usually, it's to help families when patients pass. I'm busy doing my thing and I walk past room 19 and I hear our chaplain borderline yelling Spanish at the dude, and then he just stopped his manic episode. All of the clocks changed in every patient room right after. I tried to look up 0413 in the Bible for some kind of weird reference but found nothing. Mostly because of laziness. It was just a spooky day. 22nd story. Psychology nurse here. My current hospital is in a listed building and a lot of weird stuff happens. Several members of the team have seen an older woman with a black dress and her hair in a tight bun wandering the hallways, heard a dog barking, doors slamming shut, that kind of thing. Once we had an agency nurse turn up freaked out because she was late. She said on the driveway she had to stop for a woman with an old-fashioned pram stopped in front of her, then vanished. The strangest was 10 years back when the larger rooms were separated by curtains. The carers went in to help a woman void her bladder, but she kept refusing and was terrified. She eventually told them that she would use the bedpan when the man behind the curtain left. She was the sole occupant of the room. 23rd story. I'm an intensive care unit nurse. A patient's son rang the hospital at 11 at night. On a Saturday night saying he was sure his dad was dying. His dad had had a severe stroke and was doing okay. Recovery would be difficult, but he wasn't expected to die and was pretty stable at the time. I was looking after him and he was a lot of work because he would try to get up but couldn't walk, so he downfallen a lot. The son really wanted to come in, even though it is way past visiting hours, but you know I bend the rules in a good cause. I figured what the heck it is his Saturday night. Come on in and sit with your dad. Patient died about 2 minutes before the son walked in the door. It was like a switch was turned off. He just died. The last thing he said to me was, "Am I bothering anyone?" I told him of course not, even though he had some very frustrating behavior because of the stroke. The son just started crying and screaming. I knew it. How the heck he knew? We were all a bit freaked out. 24th story. Worked in a nursing home long-term facility for multiple years. Personally didn't experience anything too crazy apart from mystery call, lights call, bell system going off, no buttons lit up, no rooms lit up. System would have to be reset from the electrical room to clear it. Hearing doors close shut, toilets flushing, faucets running. These were by no means commonplace. Other staff had some more direct experiences though. Apparently in one hall a little girl would occasionally be seen walking. This had been reported by multiple staff as well as patients. A staff member was sitting out in her car during night shift when some woman who knocked on her window and quickly disappeared. The next day she was discussing this out loud with the oncoming shift when someone pulled out a picture from old files based on the description provided. Apparently it was a match to a former patient that had passed away at least 10 years before that staff member was hired. 25th story. We had a little boy come by ambulance and was a toddler. His parents had put him to bed and he was with a cold. Nothing serious but developed tragically into more, and he started coming in and out of consciousness. We had to do a rapid intubation, and he ended up passing away a few days later. Before Mom-Dad made it to hospital, he kept talking about his baby sister Hannah. Not soon after, we had to life-saving measures. I was distraught because I had a son similar in age and a daughter named Hannah. Fast forward. Approximately 2 years later, family comes in with sick infant. They remembered me I did once I recalled their story, and I was their provider again. Their daughter's name was Hannah. It startled me, and I recalled with clarity the boy speaking of his sister, whom I assumed was alive and at home. No, she wasn't even conceived yet. Baby, thankfully, went home with parents and doing well, but I'll never forget that. Little boy and his baby sister Hannah. 26th story. My mom used to do in-home care, not exactly a nurse. One day she was at a man's house feeding him his supper. She cleaned up, made sure the man was set up, and said goodbye before leaving. He seemed perfectly normal to her. As she walked down the front driveway to her car, she got a weird feeling. She kept walking until a random huge gush of wind stopped her in her tracks. She tells me she heard someone telling her to go back. She turned back and went inside to find that the man had passed. If she had left, he probably wouldn't have been found for a couple days. 27th story. This was an odd experience. I'm a nurse in the intensive care unit and was on call during a big-ass snowstorm. I didn't want to drive home and risk getting called back in, so I stayed at the hospital that night on our little couch in our break room. I dozed in and out throughout the night, but I got caught in some state between wakefulness and sleep, and I fucking swear to God I felt this malevolent being in the room with me at one point. It was super dark, and I just felt anger from it. Like this unbridled hatred and rage. It was so heavy it was palpable. It almost felt like it was jealous I was alive. Anyway, it came down on top of me and pretty much collapsed through me, and I just heard it cry in seething anger. Then, it was gone and I was fully awake. I've had sleep paralysis from time to time, but this felt different. And I have never felt such hatred from anything I've come across in my life, real or conjured. The cliché part here is this happened around 3 o'clock in the morning. 28th story. Very young certified nursing assistant here. I was doing clinicals at a nursing home when it happened. An older female resident had passed and no one had opened the window. For context, you open the window to A. Let the smell of the body out, and B. To let the soul pass on. I'm only 17 and it was a little difficult to deal with a death this young. I was cleaning the hall she stayed on, and I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye. I turned and saw her sitting in her chair, just staring at the TV. I looked away and looked back, and she was gone. I didn't tell anyone, because hey, I'm young and dumb, no nurse supervisor was going to believe me. It's not that it was scary, it was just upsetting. I don't believe her spirit got to pass on. 29th story. I'm a night shift nurse on a labor and delivery, postpartum unit. Everyone who works there has stories of it being haunted and whatnot, and some of it I believe comes from being all alone on a quiet unit. I was down there by myself taking care of one mom with her baby. The patient knew that it was just me and her down there. Well, probably around 2 o'clock in the morning she put on her light, and when I walked in there she asked, "Did another mom come in and have a baby?" I said, "No." "Why do you ask?" She looked really confused and said that she had woke up because she heard some loud banging, a baby crying, and mom crying coming from the next room. I told her that no one had come in tonight, and we were still both the only ones there. Both of us were a little uneasy after that. Sorry for any grammar errors, I'm on mobile. 30th story. Hi, this happened to me when I just started working as a therapist in a nursing home. I live in Argentina, and if you don't know, Argentina is a very religious country, Catholic, Christian for the most part, but I was raised in a Umbanda family. Umbanda is a pagan cult for some people. Anyway, the nursing home was an old house remodeled to be a good place for the elders that live there, plus a building of 7-story, known as the very important person since the wealthiest elders went there. 7th floor is just deposit and offices. I heard from the nurses and security to never go alone to the office on the 7th floor of the very important person since it's haunted. Because of my beliefs, I do believe in this kind of thing, so I tried to never go alone. But one day I had to get some documents from that office and I needed them as soon as possible, so I went alone. I was in the elevator, and for some reason it was cold at the moment. It was summer, so we had 35 to 38 Celsius, but I ignored it. I make my to the office, and when I'm there I hear a clear voice saying to me, "You belong in hell, you filthy sinner." It was the voice of an old man. I never told anyone about my belief since it's something wrong for almost everyone I know, so I have no idea how he knew about it. Thank you for watching this video to the end. Write in the comments under the video your similar stories. And also be sure to subscribe to our channel to not miss new super interesting videos, and I advise you to watch our other videos.